Support for Disrupted comes from the Connecticut Office of Film, Television, and Digital Media.
In 2017, Librarian of Congress, Dr. Carla Hayden, introduced the new Poet Laureate at her inaugural reading.
Our great American poet and newest Poet Laureate knows how to give us the news our minds and hearts and souls most need. Please join me in welcoming Tracy K. Smith.
Tracy used her platform to bring people together during a time of political division. In 2018, she traveled the country for a series called American Conversations, celebrating poems in rural communities. At the event, she encouraged people to share their thoughts regardless of their background. Here's Tracy speaking in Alaska.
There is this idea that in order to really experience a poem, you've got to have a specialized vocabulary. You have to have a wide knowledge of the literary, canon. I don't really believe that.
Tracy's term as Poet Laureate ended in 2019, but she still uses poetry to build connections. From Connecticut Public Radio, this is Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. This hour, we're talking about poetry and community. Tracy K. Smith is Boylston Professor of Rhetoric and Oratory at Harvard University. Her 2011 collection, Life on Mars, won a Pulitzer Prize. Her new book is Fear Less: Poetry in Perilous Times. Tracy, thank you so much for joining us on Disrupted.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
I am someone who has loved poetry for a very long time. I grew up in a place that was home to Anne Spencer. So we were raised to read poetry, to connect via poetry. Every girl on my block could recite Ego Trippin' by Nikki Giovanni as if we had written it ourselves, while we were reading things like Robert Frost or County Cullen as well. And even with that lifelong poetry love, I can't really define for a person what poetry is. I know how it makes me feel. I know how it makes me think. You are the expert here. Tell me how you define what is a poem and what is poetry.
Oh, it is a hard question because poems feel like different things at different times, depending on what your need is. But one of my favorite definitions of a poem came to me from a teacher, Lucy Brock-Broido. The poet Lucy Brock-Broido was my teacher, my first poetry teacher. And she said, a poem is a stranger walking up to you saying, hey, come here. Let me tell you what it was like. And then going to great feats of language, and that's different things in different voices, to convey a sense of immediacy, urgency, and I think the most important thing is something like revelation or discovery. Whatever this encounter or observation or recollection activated, it's the spark or the thrill that I think makes many of us come back again and again to different poems and the same poem at different times in our lives. Another way that I think of what poems do is they allow us to step more deliberately, more viscerally, and with a greater control over the passage of time toward a person, a voice, or an event, and to mine it for much more than ordinary time allows us to get. That's what really led me to poems, the sense that so many things I miss, or so many things I don't have the wherewithal or the courage to say in time aren't lost, because poetry is a form that allows you to transcend the passage of time and to reconnect or connect in a fuller way with almost anything. No, with anything.
I love that piece, the ability to connect with anything. And when we think of connecting with anything, we often think in the external. You have talked about poetry allowing you to connect internally with yourself, with your vision of yourself, even in those moments when you didn't quite feel that you were where you wanted to be. You write in this book that you were drawn to poetry because you felt small. Talk to us about that relationship and being drawn to poetry.
Yeah. I was 19 or 20 when when I came to realize that what I wanted to do was not to grow up and become a writer, but to start writing poetry as a vocation right then and there. And in large part, it was because I was away from home for the first time. I felt like all the things that had defined me as special in my family or in my community or among my loving teachers didn't matter as much as I thought they did. And I needed something that could console me and something that could restore or reconfigure a sense of who I was for myself. And poems helped to do that. And I think in large part because a poem invites you into somebody else's experience. And oftentimes poems focus on experiences that destabilize us, things that we don't have a ready to go vocabulary for. And they allow something to be built, to be wrestled with, and to be won, I want to say. Robert Frost describes a poem as a momentary stay against confusion. He has many, many great definitions of poetry, but that's one. Yeah. And what it really tells me is that those other feelings will be back. Something else will activate that feeling of smallness or fear or worry or loneliness. But this one moment with this one poem affords you something that ministers to that feeling and that might even be durable, something you can turn to, a perspective, a form of language, a form of seeing or hearing that can be useful to you in other situations.
It requires a great deal of not just self-awareness, but bravery to say at 19, this is not just what I want to do, this is who I am. And to step into that at 19 when so many things are swirling about what direction that could go. Were there ever moments of doubt where you said, I don't know, maybe this isn't the thing that will carry me through? Or did you just keep pushing toward that ideal of, I'm stepping into being a poet and a writer and embracing it, even if the journey may be uncertain?
I was pretty dogged, not out of a sense of ambition, but out of a sense that somehow this art form keeps being useful to me. First of all, telling my family that that was my choice at 19 was a little bit disconcerting for them, right? And then withstanding all of the loving concern that says, why don't you do that as a hobby and do these other more practical things? But again and again in my life, poems helped me. The first major upheaval that I went on to experience was just a few years later when my mother passed away after an experience of cancer. And I was sending out resumes to jobs, but I was also going upstairs to my room and reading elegies and listening to other people's experience of grief and using that to help me come up with my own vocabulary for what I was going through, for where my mother was, and for forging a connection with her that defied the absence of her physical presence in my life. And it was hard for me to argue against something that could do that. And I actually still feel that way. I think that poems, which is really a way of saying a faithfulness to the limitless capacities of language and reason and feeling and empathy or compassion, I think many of our problems can be mightily tended to with those tools.
You talk about those tools and how those tools have held you in your life. You are, in many ways, an evangelist for the power of poetry because you share that with so many people. And let's be really frank, Tracy. For some people, poetry is intimidating. For some people, it's very esoteric, or dare I say, some people think it's boring, or they'll say, I just don't get it. I don't understand it, as if there's like this magical key to it. But you have done so much work to say poetry has the power to meet you where you are, that it doesn't have to be these sort of complicated words and convoluted lines. Poetry can speak in a language that connects to heart and mind and soul, just as the power of any good art form. How do you respond when people say, like, poetry is just not my thing, I don't get it, or I'm not really interested in poetry? How do you respond to that?
Well, first of all, as much as I love my art form, I understand where that perspective comes from. And I think it comes in large part from the pressure that many people are made to feel to answer the wrong questions about poems. What is the poet trying to say? What is the message of this poem? What does this poem mean? These are questions that pull us away from much of what characterizes poetry, which is a movement outside of linear logic, which much of our lives actually, operate outside of logic. An interest in sound as a site of meaning. Music does that, but we don't struggle to understand that. And also a leaping of the imagination from one thing to another, not based on an argument or not based on reason, but based on something else. These two things happened in the same way, or to the same person, or sitting here in this room, suddenly I'm visited by a memory that feels useful to what's happening here. And so I'll go there. Our dreams do that. So we know how to respond to much of what is surprising about poems. We know how to do that. But when we're asked those limiting questions, it can become very frustrating. You can feel almost like someone's out to get you. And so one of the first things I try to do, and what the laureateship allowed me to do in many different places, was to say, you have everything you need to have a fruitful encounter with this poem. All you have to do is pay attention to what the poem causes you to see, hear, feel, wonder, and remember. We can go a long distance with just your responses to those questions. And actually, in that context, those questions allowed us to open up to one another, total strangers in many cases, to open up to one another about our most powerful experiences, our most vulnerable qualities, or the regions of our lives that make us feel most vulnerable or most hopeful. And I don't think that has to be filtered through a specific and limiting vocabulary. That's not to say that there aren't other ways of reading, responding to, and I don't want to say measuring, but aligning poems with other topics and literary traditions, and thinking about tools and thinking about the craft-based choices that allow those emotional and visceral effects to happen. But if you don't have those things, it need not bar you from having a really personal connection to the art form.
Coming up, more with former U.S. Poet Laureate Tracy K. Smith. She'll offer some thoughts on artificial intelligence.
We're being led to make our lives more efficient at the expense of our living.
This is Disrupted. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. This hour, we're talking about the power of poetry to bring people together. We're still joined by former U.S. Poet Laureate and Pulitzer Prize winner Tracy K. Smith. Her new book is Fear Less: Poetry in Perilous Times. I've always been fascinated with the difference between experiencing poetry as a reader and experiencing poetry as a listener. Listening to someone deliver a poem can offer insight into how they interpret the poem. I asked Tracy to read one of her works, Everybody's Autobiography.
This poem begins out of a dream that I had that became useful to some of my questions in my waking life. Everybody's Autobiography. I find myself most alone when I believe I am striving for glory. These times, cool and sharp, a monument of moon-white stone lodges in place near my heart. In a dream, My children glisten inside raindrops or teardrops, like strangers, like seeds of children. I will only be allowed to claim them if I consent to love everyone's children. If I consent to love everyone's children, only then will I be allowed to claim them, my strangers, my seeds of children, glistening inside raindrops or teardrops in my dream. Children lodged in place near my heart, a monument of moon-white stone, cool and sharp. I believe I am striving for glory when I find myself most alone.
Our listeners will note in hearing that poem that the second half is somewhat of a mirror of the first. Talk to us about that structure of the poem. You know, the fact that you said these notes came to you in a dream that helped you make sense of your waking time. Talk to us about the structure and approach of this poem.
Oh, sure. Form helps me get traction through the material that wants to be part of my poems. And sometimes I turn to a very prescriptive form like this, which is a palindrome, or some people call it a pendulum poem because it swings one direction and then it has to follow that same arc back in the opposite direction. It meant that I had to literally sit with and listen to and be guided by the very same poems that got me to the middle of the poem on my way out of the poem. And it means you have to look at things and hear things twice. And ideally, there's a little bit of difference between those two encounters. And I imagine, I really can't say much more about what that difference is because it's probably largely contingent on what a reader hears and feels and what's activated for a reader. That's why I say, how could you ask me what this poem means? I like that you ask what the poem does formally and how that speaks to the material. I was thinking a lot about the violence that we live with in the world and the love and the fear and the sense of protectiveness that I have for my own children. The poem allowed or forced me to open up the radius of concern and to say, if I want myself to be less alone or less feeling like I can't do what I must do, I have to change my frame of reference. I love the idea of finding a charge to love more people fully and willingly in spite of or perhaps because of the difficulty of that task. And in a world where we're constantly witnessing, arguing about, and recoiling from the trauma and the shame of war, these are questions that come up again and again, and we find ourselves having to negotiate them differently each time.
One of the things that I love about your work is that the pace of this world, the pace of our lives, often does not allow time or space or reward for being still, to be able to have those moments of reflection, to think deeply about how changing our frame of reference can be liberating and freeing and connecting. And that seems to be woven through so much of your work of what would happen if we took a step back and thought about how we connect with each other in very different ways. And because this came out of a dream, even dreams as an opportunity to reflect. Does that happen often for you that, your dreams spark these kinds of connections, or was it unique to this particular poem?
It's not a frequent site that I mine for poems, or poems don't arrive often, although there have been a few that I've woken up from dreams saying, I must write this down. But in many ways, it is similar to how dreams work, where something that's in your unconscious mind or your memory rises to the surface. Oftentimes for me, it's memory that does this. And memory can be triggered by just about anything, a smell, a sound, a taste. And the usefulness or the unresolvedness or the irresolution, I should say, of something that that's behind me, or so I think, can be a useful starting point for a poem.
When you write about engaging with poetry, you say the following in the book, quote, "What I am describing isn't simply a literary operation. It's a set of essential life skills." Why is reading and experiencing poetry an essential life skill?
I think there are lots of reasons why. The first is that it means you are slowly listening and deeply listening, and you are holding on to every kernel of meaning, whatever that might look or sound like. And you're trusting that it has a purpose. And you're trusting that there can be meaning and purpose delivered to you from the life and the testimony of a total stranger, someone who you may never meet, someone who may not be alive, or someone who may be a figment of the author's imagination. And we do that. We get caught up in the drama and in the wisdom and in the growth of characters or speakers in literature. And I think if we are willing to, we can carry that sense of regard and investment into actual life, into civic life, whereby people who live in communities that are far from our own, or who have values and customs that might seem far from our own, we can trust that there is some facet of their experience that we ourselves can attest to and corroborate. And I think the extra step is we trust that they can do the same for us. I think that's a huge life skill that we're discouraged in most other contexts from having. We are discouraged from opening ourselves up to the authority and the centrality of other people as consumers. Oftentimes we are discouraged from thinking about that because we're competing for power or standing or attention, or so we believe. And to unlearn some of those reactive behaviors, to unlearn the notion that I can't make space for you because I need to take up that space. I think that's a life skill. It's not just about courtesy. It's about learning to put ourselves in perspective in the fullness that is the actual world that we live in.
To be able to put ourselves into perspective and in relation as well,
yes,
is so important. Let's talk about this latest book, Fearless, Poetry in Perilous Times. It is not a collection of poetry. It is a guide, a primer, an inspiration, if you will, to help readers understand the power of poetry. And in this book, you reflect on what you call your own reading practice that also reminds us of being able to experience and being open to an experience beyond what is just present and comfortable for us. Talk to us about this new book and why you think it's important to read poetry, particularly in perilous times.
Well, I wanted to write about the incredibly practical tool that poetry is, in large part because we live in a time where language is training us to put up borders between ourselves and others, to mistrust everyone and everything, and to cleave only to something like an us or a we, some naive or idealistically defined group that's pitted against a very rigidly defined them that is discredited. I think our national vocabulary has defaulted to this mode, and I think it's destroying our culture. It is making us fearful and hateful toward one another. And I think it's locking us out of the largest and most enduring human capacities that we're all born with and that we're here to use for love, for change, for inspiration, for evolution. and to lift one another up. And so this book says, hey, if language, our behavior in language and the default patterns of language that we have succumbed to have diminished the sense of possibility available to us, maybe language can help fix things. Maybe if we find a way to pay fuller attention to how we hear and therefore define and therefore value things, we can rewire ourselves and we can, maybe save democracy, or maybe we can create, something that is about everybody flourishing. And I think that the curiosity, the comfort with difficulty, the patience, and the empathy or compassion that poems reactivate in us, those things are life-saving. They're not just life skills, they're life-saving.
I'm listening to you talk about these life-saving skills to develop. And it's reminding me that so often I feel like we have lost sight of how to talk to one another, whether it is our reliance on technology and shorthand, and those ways of communicating, whether it was the social distancing that we needed to keep ourselves safe during the pandemic and the lockdown, and the ways that we never really came back into that, or just the overall tone that always feels so divisive and feels so condemning and indicting as opposed to inspiring and building. For you, as someone who has made really their life's work of affirming the power of words, the intentionality of language, what do you make of this time where AI and Chat GPT and large language learning models seem to be making communication so much more transactional than connecting and building? What does that mean for you as a poet and someone who respects the power of words?
I find it incredibly saddening, because I recognize that it is an exchange of agency. It is a surrendering of skills and tools that humans have long championed to something that emerges from but a fragment of our humanity, and that exists to serve an economic market. It exists to enrich specific people. Yes, there are things AI can do that might help us, but AI, I believe, exists because it's profitable. It would not have been invested in if it were solely for the humane good of others. And that makes me think we're being distracted. We're being led to make our lives more efficient at the expense of our living. I really feel that way. And in terms of my own context as a writer, I know how much formulating thoughts in language and then correcting them, reinforcing them with more insight, clarity, and conviction, more corroborating them with fact. That's how we learn. Not just how we learn to write, but how we learn to think and how we know what we believe. It's not because there are word packets, word phrases. They're called phrases that tell us, oh, everything's all good, or that summarize things in a very glib, pat way that robs us of the ability to say, but wait, it's actually not quite good, but I want to tell you exactly what's missing and exactly what I'm, what I'm learning to do. When we eliminate that process, I think we begin to eliminate the possibilities for what we might seek, what we might strive toward. It worries me in terms of students and writing because of thinking. It worries me as well because it allows certain of us to believe that getting an answer and having a response is better than the content of what that response might be and the degree to which it can become memorable and furtherable with more attention and intention.
Coming up, more with Pulitzer Prize-winning poet Tracy K. Smith. She talks about how poetry can help us move through big emotions.
I think poems say, I've been through this, here's what it felt like to me. And when you spend time with enough poems, some of those perspectives become useful to you in the moment of difficulty.
This is Disrupted. Stay with us. Welcome back to Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. This hour, we're discussing the power of poetry to build community. We're still joined by former U.S. Poet Laureate and Pulitzer Prize winner Tracy K. Smith. We're talking about her new book, Fear Less: Poetry in Perilous Times. Here's more from our conversation. Perilous Times in this book is not just about this current moment that I feel like so many people are focusing on, rightfully so. But how do we prepare, think about, work through the next perilous time, or understand the previous perilous time and the things that we said we would learn, the things we would do differently. I keep thinking about during the lockdown where I said, oh, this is teaching me to be more present and not to feel like I have to rush and load up my calendar. I'm going to do this differently. And the minute outside reopened, my calendar became ridiculous again. But I'm thinking, Tracy, about when you started your term as Poet Laureate of the United States. 2017 was a perilous time for many people in this country. And you didn't shy away from it. You stepped into it to say, let us leverage this perilous time to bring people together who would not normally be in space together. You launched a program called American Conversations, celebrating poetry in rural communities. Tell us more about that initiative.
The idea for that came from the awareness that our demeanor toward one another had become instantly divisive, and that we were being persuaded and beginning to believe that we had nothing in common or nothing to say to people who don't share our ideals and our voting habits. I think that position exists because we are activated into a mode of defensiveness and debate by so much that we take in. But I know we can we can listen to each other. And I know that we can be generous toward one another. What assured me of that in many ways was the reverence with which my students would listen to their peers in the poetry workshops that I teach, or the ability of someone to lean toward the perspective of a speaker on a page who was so utterly unlike themselves. I said, if debate is the mode, or attack is the mode that we're trained to revert to or default to, leading with something like a poem might allow us to talk about the very same topics that usually rile us up, but in a different tone of voice. And so, because most of my time as a writer is spent in cities and university towns, I thought it might be useful to go into spaces where there's not a lot of literary programming on a regular basis, and to sit down with people and read poems together, poems by other living American poets, and say, what do you notice? What does this remind you of? I had the most heart-filling conversations with people who didn't think they knew very much about poetry. They taught me worlds about the poems that I had selected and that I've long loved and long taught, because they brought it close to home for themselves. And they said, I know this poem. One man in a rehab facility in Kentucky said, I know this poem is about love. I know it's a love poem, a breakup poem, but it reminds me of my relationship to substance, and that the difficulty of saying goodbye. This poem helps me deal with what I'm trying to do. And I thought, wow, if we just listen to each other, we could help each other so much. And we would learn to trust and validate one another. And so American Conversations was about taking the opportunity to do that by way of poems, which are written in response to every single one of life's events, love, loss, grief, fear, anger, history, and the imagined future, and any and every other thing that comes to mind. There's a poem that can help us grapple with.
What did that experience teach you about yourself? To go into spaces where you would not normally be. And I love that you talked about sitting with communities, not standing before, but sitting with communities. What did that experience teach you about Tracy K. Smith?
It reminded me that we are all best in a state of relative humility, when we can be beholden to others. And, to get a phone call from the Librarian of Congress and be told she would like you to be the poet laureate, that's an immense honor. And it can give you the feeling that you've really arrived and that there's something you do that you do in a special way. But the real gifts of poetry are the gifts that remind us that we're all special and we're all filled with wisdom, and that sometimes the best thing we can do is sit down at the feet of another person and listen and receive. I think that really, it was a beautiful reminder about what's important. It also urged me to accept that while I love the rigor of craft as an artist, and I love teaching my students about literary history and about these formal tools that they can learn to use toward many different kinds of useful and purposeful ends, we read poems because they touch us. And I think my teaching has been reconfigured by that. That space of feeling isn't always centered in classrooms, but I've been emboldened to bring that into the teaching because it reminds us that we're not just brains. We're full beings, with a host of capacities, all of which are important for us to share.
In that vein of connecting people and reminding us of that humanity and being able to be fully ourselves, I'd ask you to share with us your poem, Charity.
Sometimes I write poems because things happen, or I observe things that I'm unsettled by. And so a poem allows me to go back and dwell with that by bringing it back into my presence via language, and to find what's useful for me in it. And oftentimes what's useful is what it reflects about something in myself that I need to become more aware of. Charity. She is like a squat old machine, off kilter, but still chugging along the uphill stretch of sidewalk on Harrison Street, handbag slung crosswise and, I'm guessing, heavy. And oh, the set of her face, her brows profound tracks, her mouth cinched, lips pressed flat. Watching her bend forward to tussle with gravity, watching the birth she allows each foot, as if one is not on civil terms with the other. Watching her shoulders braced, as if lashed by step after step after step, and her eyes' determination not to shift or blink or rise. I think I am you, one day out of 5, tired, empty, hating what I carry, but afraid to lay it down, stingy, angry, doing violence to others by the sheer freight of my gloom, halfway home, wanting to stop, to quit, but keeping going, mostly out of spite.
Some people may listen to that poem or read it and be surprised by the title, Charity. Make that clear for us.
I wanted to ask myself why the sight of this stranger walking down the street toward me one day as I was walking home bothered me so much. She was bothered by something. She was exhausted, and her exhaustion was, like contagious. And I was feeling like put out and judgmental. And sometimes I try and use poems to get to my better self. And I said, okay, let's just give in to this gaze of judgment and distaste and follow it to the other side. And so for me, I began to see all of her put uponness as something that I know intimately, something that I was probably transmitting on my way home from work at the same time. It's a mix of self-pity and maybe like the feeling of being beaten down sometimes and never getting to rest. And the moment when the poem becomes a self-portrait for me is a moment when I begin to imagine that the version of me who was walking down the streets would like to find that woman and say, I'm sorry. I'm sorry for what I thought. And writing the poem and allowing that process to happen in language felt like the next best thing to that kind of repentant act.
This book also talks a lot about vulnerability, that kind of reflection that you just mentioned, of being able to say, what was it about this person that I don't know, I may never encounter again? Something about it was sitting on my spirit. What was that about? And so many of us experience these big emotions, these big life changes and shifts that it may be too hard or too painful or too difficult to confront. And you talk about poetry having the ability to help us move through. And there's a piece of it that just really spoke to me where you said, I love that you reference mother poetry. And you say in this book that mother poetry, and this is the lead up to the 2016 election, I believe. You said mother poetry speaks to you and said, come, sit, calm yourselves, and attend more generously to one another. I feel like I need to write that out and put it on my mirror every day to remind ourselves to be fully present, even when the feelings are difficult or would be easier to just avoid. How does poetry help us move through those big emotions and big events?
One answer that comes to mind is an answer my mother would often give me when I would tell her something was going wrong or I wasn't feeling right. And she would console me first by saying, you're not the first person in the world to feel this way, and you will not be the last. And somehow that phrase, no matter how many times I heard it, welcomed me back into the human family. And I could feel safe that what I was going through was not an aberration, even if it was difficult or unpleasant. I think poems say that to us. I think poems say, I've been through this. Here's what it felt like to me. And when you spend time with enough poems, some of those perspectives become useful to you in the moment of difficulty. And that's a big thing, to be able to name, not just like to name as in this is awful, but to say, oh, I'm struggling because I love this person. Grief is actually a manifestation of love. Poems have shown me that. And so I'm not sick, I'm not lost, I'm doing something humans do. Or I'm angry, I'm bitter, and this is something humans do and can learn to get past. Poems remind me of this. I think that to know that our most difficult challenges are things that other people somewhere, somewhen are sharing with us. It doesn't just make us more respectful of others. I think it allows us to be more honest and thereby more charitable toward ourselves. It prevents the need to grab onto some of these other justifications that are false, that are self-aggrandizing, and that default to the sense that it's not me, it's them. And that does not actually heal. In fact, it is a way of perpetuating harm. And so changing our perspective about how we sit in or belong to this large family, as varied and difficult as family can be, I think it empowers us to offer different things to ourselves and others when they are needed, which is always.
Always. And you always remind us of this need for gentleness and generousness, not just to others, as you said, but to ourselves, and how that can carry us through perilous times, whether they are perilous times that we experience communally because of what's happening in the world or what's happening on our job or whatever that is, or the things that we often feel we are experiencing in a more solitary format. That reminder that we are always in need of that, I think, can carry us through. My last question to you. We are indeed in perilous times. Many of us are searching and hoping and building so that we don't just survive, but we actually are having the opportunity to build and to know that we are able to do these hard things. And so my question to you is, even in perilous times, what brings you hope and joy?
Beautiful question. Sometimes what brings me hope, actually, every time I enter the classroom, I sit down with students who are willingly giving their brilliance and their time and their talent to a process that makes their inner lives larger and richer, and that teaches us all to hope different things for the world that we participate in. That's a huge part of what keeps me going. I also find a lot of consolation lately in the lyric imagination of a poet like Rumi, mystic, a 13th century mystic poet who is invested in the eternal, who is invested in the long, never-ending journey of the soul, and who is also invested in the gritty day-to-day of life on earth. And sometimes in my logic-based mind or my argument-based, personality, the world gets smaller and smaller as I fight toward what I think things should look like. And that can be augmented by saying, oh, but if I look up and out toward what I can't prove, but what fills me with a different kind of capacity, that can keep me going too. And that can rub off on others who need to keep going for this long journey that we're on.
Here's to more looking up and out with that hope, with that sense of connection and possibility. Tracy K. Smith is Boylston Professor of Oratory and Rhetoric at Harvard. She was the 22nd Poet Laureate of the United States from 2017 to 2019. Her latest book is Fear Less: Poetry in Perilous Times. Thank you so much, Tracy.
Thank you.
Disrupted is produced by Kevin Chang Barnum, Robin Doyon-Aiken, Erica McIntosh, and Meg Fitzgerald. Our interns are V. Zhuang and Tale Ricketson. You can listen to more than 250 episodes of Disrupted in our archive, and you can find us wherever you get your podcast. From Connecticut Public Radio, this is Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown Dean. Thanks for listening.